Hi, I'm Dajana Yoakley. I'm a peaceful parenting coach and mom of three, and I'm delighted to give you the latest science backed research on child development, parenting, and to support you in showing up as the parent that you want to be. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I'm here today with Dr. Melissa Goldberg Mintz. Welcome, Melissa. So glad to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and chat about parenting and trauma.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here after you were on our Healing Parent Summit. Great conversation. I know you and Emily had the interview there, and I know our audience really benefited from information about this topic of, um, you know, how do you know if your child has been traumatized and what can parents do about that? And, we'll talk a little bit more about different types of traumas, but yeah, would you share just a little bit for those that didn't catch the interview in the summit or are not familiar with your work? Would you just share a little bit about how you came to do this work and also a little bit about your book?
Sure. So let's see. I am a little bit about me. I am a mom of two living in Houston, Texas. I'm a clinical psychologist and author of the book, Has Your Child Been Traumatized? I came to do this work. I was always fascinated with the world of psychology. So I knew I wanted to be a psychologist, but I came to trauma work and child trauma work in particular when I was doing some work as part of a clinical trial working with traumatized children. And I was just blown away by how some of these really, really tough cases of horrifying things, the kids with supportive parents who were armed with the skills, they got better. And I just found it to be so rewarding. And I knew I wanted to be a part of that for my career. So then fast forward, about a decade into my career, I realized there were so many great books out there about how to raise resilient children, um,
Mhm.
but not a lot about what to do if your child has already been traumatized. How do you recognize it? What do you do? How do you treat it? Those sorts of things. So that's why I wrote the book and a little bit about me.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that sounds like a great background. And when we are kind of defining trauma, what kind of trauma are we talking about here with kids? Could you kind of clarify for us, like when we say, has your child been traumatized? What are we saying? Does that trauma mean?
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question to get started with. So, I think a lot of people, the way it's used in pop culture is it's something scary or overwhelming that's happened, but that's not what trauma is. Trauma is actually the way that someone's body responds to a scary event. So the event itself can be anything. So it can range from things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence, to things like being attacked by the family pet or like being pushed in the pool at a pool party, or even being shown pornography by an older friend or sibling, something like that. But what we know is that it's not the event itself. So two kids can experience the same stressor, and one might go on to be traumatized while another experiences natural recovery.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd love for you to touch on, yeah, it sounds like from what I understand, like there's like these big T traumas and then like the other kind. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about like, just to clarify that a little further as well.
Sure, sure. So again, very prevalent in how we talk about trauma in pop culture. So the way that I understand it is like the events we were referring to that, have the potential to traumatize as being like a big T trauma, whereas maybe like a little T is something more commonplace that can happen. So, friend drama in school, things like that. But the way I think about it is any event has the potential to traumatize, and I don't want to dismiss any like little t
Yeah.
trauma as something that doesn't have the potential to traumatize. I think bullying is a great example of that. Some kids might get, made fun of at school and it just sort of rolls off their shoulder as part of like the normal childhood experience. Whereas
hmm
another child, it might have the potential to really sort of wreck their trajectory and give them a hard time.
Yeah. So what you're saying is it depends on how the child's like nervous system or body is experiencing the event. And if it feels overwhelming to them, if it's not processed, right? Like other events, it becomes a trauma. So it's not like any other event. It kind of overwhelms them and it becomes like a marker, like a marked event that somehow their body has recorded differently than other events
Yeah,
in
that's
their
a great way
in
of
life.
explaining it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd love for us to, as we kind of get into the topic further in your book, I'd love to also kind of help parents understand how when sometimes we can have like relationship traumas, right? Like when there's disconnection in the parent-child relationship, and maybe there's maybe unresolved, overwhelming and unresolved relationship conflict in the parent-child relationship, or just repeated experiences of overwhelm. Whether it's environmental or whether it's like maybe parents fighting. Can
Yeah.
that be, for example, like a trauma for a child if the parents are fighting in a way that's overwhelming to the child. Even though they're not directing their anger at the child is still in that environment.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, so if we go to the criteria for trauma, it does not have to be something that you experience yourself, which actually I'd argue if a child is witnessing that type of, aggression between parents, they would be experiencing it themselves. But
Hmm.
trauma can also include hearing about or knowing about something scary happening to someone that you feel very close to. So, mom or dad, for
Hmm.
example.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah. So how can parents, what are some signs that parents might overlook otherwise that indicate a child is struggling with a traumatic experience or something, in their lives? And we know there's like medical traumas, like maybe they had to like have a medical procedure
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
maybe those are signs are a little bit more like clear. But yeah, maybe you could kind of clarify how can parents differentiate between trauma and normal, whatever normal really means, right? Like
Sure.
developmental behaviors
Yeah,
that a child
yeah,
is
because it is
taking.
normal to struggle sometimes. So what the advice that I generally give parents is to look for a change from baseline. So for example, if you had a kid who was a social butterfly who, every weekend was just out of the house doing things with friends, constantly asking you for rides to places, who now just wants to isolate in the room, that would be a red flag to me. But at the same time, if your kid was a homebody before the scary thing happened and they continue to be a homebody, that would not alarm me as much. So changes from baseline and things
Hmm.
like socializing, eating, sleeping, school performance, all of those sorts of things.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And is it possible that maybe when the child was little, the trauma kind of maybe there was like a attachment rupture
Mhm.
with a parent, and maybe kind of that relational trauma started when they were young, maybe because the parent is still working on their own earned secure attachment or their own like childhood, emotional like dysregulated moments and all this. So would they be able to then see changes significantly, if it started when the child was really little, right? I don't know. Just some
Sure.
thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the way I think about that is in terms of attachment trauma.
Yeah.
So it's not sort of the same as what we've been talking about, but I'm not sure if your followers know anything about attachment style. But
Yes.
usually, oh, they do.
Hmm.
Okay, amazing, amazing.
Yes, very much. Yeah.
So, okay, so then I'll give a couple of examples that can start like even in infancy. So, let's say that a mom has a new baby and she's just got a lot going on and she's struggling. And every time that baby cries, whether it's like needing a change or needing milk or whatever, um, it gets mom even more frazzled and even more stressed out. And the baby can pick up on that and realize, like, when I cry, if this happens again and again and again and again, I'm not talking
Hmm.
to the parents who like occasionally get overwhelmed when baby cries, because that is
Right,
totally
right,
normal. But who's just sort of consistently again and again
right.
overwhelmed by baby's cries. Baby learns, when I cry, it just makes things worse. So I'm going to keep it in, or I'm going to keep it to myself. And then as they get older, they learn like, okay, when I'm struggling with something, I'm not going to go with my problem to my mom or to other people because it's just going to make it worse if I share about my emotional pain. So that's one example of what attachment trauma and, an avoidant attachment style might look like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we know with attachment that it's a pattern, that it's something that we can shift.
Mhm.
So even if something like this was happening in the parent-child dynamic, like you said at the beginning, there's so much hope, and we actually know that we can change this shift, right? It's not permanent. But I think the first step is awareness, right? Like for parents
Right.
to be aware of like, and this is like when we're talking about like, what are this like what kind of behaviors should we look for in a child that's experienced trauma? We should be aware that there are certain things that like clinicians would look for, but the parent won't know to seek out a clinician unless they're educated enough to know what those signs are themselves, right?
Mhm. Yes.
So yeah, I think awareness is kind of the first step. So when a child experiences fear or stress, what are some, very practical strategies that maybe parents can use at home to help them feel safe and calm, kind of as like a first response?
Sure. Oh, goodness. There are countless little things that parents can do. I would say my number one advice, and this goes along with promoting a secure attachment relationship, is when your
Hmm.
kid is distressed, the best way to help them regulate their emotions is by connecting to you. Because what we know is like the single best way we can manage, whether people of any age can manage our emotional distress, is by connecting to people that we feel securely attached to. So as long as you are there, you are available and you are reliable to them, that is the single best thing you can do for them. I think in addition to that, there are a number of relaxation training skills that could be helpful when they're feeling overwhelmed. So things like diaphragmatic breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, sensory based relaxation exercises. And happy to go more into any of those if you like. But there are so many of them out there.
Yeah, yeah, I love those. And just to kind of clarify, what you're saying is like, we're trying to get to a calmer state. We're trying to go into like that parasympathetic rest and digest state, social
Yeah.
engagement, right? From where? From sympathetic, like fight or flight, where the child feels like threatened and they're in fight or flight, or is it even from like parasympathetic, like dorsal collapse, right? Like we're shutting down, where if the child has shut down or dissociated. Um, yeah, just kind of curious. I talk a lot about neurobiology on the
Wow.
podcast, and I just kind of love the science.
Yes.
So I'm just kind of curious, like we're going to parasympathetic nervous system to calm down. Because like you mentioned, all these techniques are like calm, 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 safe, secure, calm. But there is another state of parasympathetic that looks calm, but it's not. It's stress, right?
Right. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I'm so happy that you brought that up. So I think a lot of the techniques I talk about, so I use, are you familiar with Dan Siegel's hand model of the brain?
Yes. Uh-huh.
I love that. So I feel like that really illustrates the sympathetic parasympathetic,
Hmm.
how that works. So when I'm teaching parents, I teach them like, okay, so your kid's here, sympathetic nervous
Hmm.
system activation. You do like a diaphragmatic breathing exercise together. It brings the cortex back online. So in my mind, that's more what I'm talking about. I think if your kid
Hmm.
is in a very shut down place, those same skills are going to be not only not as helpful, but harder to get your kid to engage with them. And I think connection is probably where we'd want to start.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that because from that polyvagal theory perspective, the connection is at the top of this ladder, right? We're trying to climb up this ladder. So the goal is to always go to connection, like you said, because
Yes.
that's where they can connect socially and that's where that secure attachment is.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I love that. We can kind of focus on connection being the ultimate, but maybe if they're triggered and they're in fight or they're running away, right? Like they're activated, we should
Sure.
try to move them into like calming down, right? And rest and
Right. And
digest.
even,
Yeah.
I mean, I think for that sympathetic state, we can have like connection and like the physiological process at the same time. Like, let's do diaphragmatic breathing together. And we're like sitting, shoulder to shoulder, doing this thing together. So it's the connection, but it's also the physiological process of like, let's calm down.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that. And I also know with like trauma with adults, at least, I don't know too much about trauma with children, but that's why I love to have you on here. I know one of the big focus points is empowerment,
Mhm.
empowerment of the traumatized individual, because I guess during a traumatic incident, the person feels powerless. because of the
Yes.
overwhelm. And my guess is the child would also feel powerless. And this approach that, that I've been trained in and that I am a proponent of, peaceful parenting, developed by Dr. Laura Markham, it's all about like not controlling the child, but coaching the child. So we're never trying to power over. We're not trying to dominate, their nervous system and their life, because it can feel overwhelming to them and they feel less empowered, right? So
Yeah.
even parenting this way, coaching versus controlling the child after we connect and self-regulate, is really a trauma-informed way of parenting, right? Because it empowers them.
Yeah.
It empowers the child to that they have a voice
Mm-hmm.
and they can
Absolutely.
say no, and it's not okay, and I don't like this, right? Like your feelings are allowed and respected, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that goes with the connection piece too. Like, if we are trying to connect with them by offering like a back rub or a hug and they're just like not in the space to receive that, and they say like, no, I need some space, that we can hear that. And instead of like taking that as a rejection and then maybe getting
Mm-hmm.
angry and like, just sort of spiraling from there, we can understand that everyone's the boss of their own body and we can respect that.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, I think that's also a great way to enhance future safety with children is like helping them feel
Yes.
empowered in their own bodies.
Yeah, I love that you're highlighting that empowerment, especially about their bodies, and that's kind of what I support parents with as well when we're talking about setting limits. Like when we set limits and boundaries with kids around unsafe behavior, and maybe against like things that are against your family values and things like that. But parents will always often ask like, what are the other things I should set limits about? Because sometimes I'm confused. Like, should I set a limit with this or not? And I think it's important to respect children's autonomy over their own bodies, right? Like, so like potty learning instead of potty training, or food, finish everything on your plate or else, or right. Like,
Yes,
and like you
yes.
said, for the future, it's like consent with like a romantic partner, like that becomes like, it's a role model. We're role modeling what we want other people, to do with them later, right? And how they can practice standing up for themselves, and for what feels right in their bodies.
Totally, totally. Because I think we have to build those muscles, particularly because in our society, like, kids are taught listen to adults, respect adults, like if grandpa wants a hug, give him a hug, that sort of thing. So
Right.
we've got to build these muscles of like, if something makes me uncomfortable, I can say no. And that
Mm-hmm.
will be respected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Um, and how can, so yeah, I don't know if you want to mention a little bit more about what role parents play in healing the child's healing from trauma. I know you shared a few like kind of practical examples, but the power of that relationship, and that security and safety. Well, you did kind of mention that in the beginning as well. Like you talked about the connection, but if you want to share any other like simple everyday practices that help support resilience and recovery in traumatized children.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, there's so much out there
Yeah,
that parents can do. And I do think parents play a more important role than therapists. Like if
love
I
to
had
hear
to
that.
pick for every traumatized kid, whether they'd have the best therapist in the world or just like parents that they feel securely attached to, 10 out of 10 times I'd pick parents that they're securely attached to. So I think parents play the biggest role. I think, just a few quick other things that parents can do. I think we can model adaptive coping skills. We can model talking about our feelings, and I think those two go together. So, for example, when I have a hard day at work, maybe I like scheduled too many patients in a row, or maybe something happened and I'm just not feeling great. I don't have to share like all the little details, but I do come home and I say, you know what, like I had a really hard day today. After dinner time, before I put you down for bed, I'm going to take a relaxing bath because that's what I need right now. And so that's like coping, or like I'm going to go call my best friend and I'm going to talk about it, or I'm going to go on a run, or I'm going to talk to my own therapist. So just modeling that like everybody has bad days, it's okay to talk about it, and we cope. That's what we do. So I think those are
Mm,
some great things that parents can do. In addition, just some of the basics. I love like validating kids' feelings. So even
yeah.
when you disagree with them, so like say your kid is like having a fit about like not wanting to go to school or something like that. Instead of saying something like, well, you're going, too bad, tough luck, saying like, oh my gosh, I hear you. I definitely had days when I was a kid when I didn't want to go to school. We are still going to go. Is there anything I can do to help make it easier for you? Or can we plan something to look forward to after school?
Yeah. So kind of that, the way the way that we relate kind of moment to moment in general, having it very welcoming of the emotions, because right, like the emotions that are difficult for kids to share and process can feel overwhelming, right? And that can maybe result
Totally.
in a trauma too, right? Like the smaller traumas, right? Like overwhelmed emotion, not processed, stuck in the body, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so parents creating that opening and sharing and validation of and safety for emotions is important for kids to process.
Sure.
And I love how you shared like the parent narrating their own suffering day to day and how they're going to resolve it. Because so much of the time, I think parents kind of like just take care of it without
Yeah,
sharing with their kids. And then they're like, I don't know why my teen won't take my advice about what to do. And it's like, well, it's like it's been this like desert, and then all of a sudden we want to tell them all these things that they can do to like handle these relationships or to handle stress, but it's just
sure.
like it's a different, now it's like a surprise, and it's totally catches the child off guard, so they're like, what is this, a lecture? Whereas if we're just doing it in small bits and role modeling indirectly, I think kids are more receptive and learning. Do you find that to be true as well?
Oh, yeah, I think so. And I think another thing that goes along with that is like you set the stage early that your kid can come and talk to you about anything that's uncomfortable. And you don't like freak out about it. You give them honest answers. I think when you set that stage early, then they're going to be more likely to come to you when they're teens. Now, like there will be a decrease for, kids when they hit the teenage years, even if they have the most healthy relationship with their parents. And that's good. That's adaptive. They're coming into their own and it's what we'd expect. But by setting
Mhm.
the groundwork early, we can definitely, I guess, improve closeness and improve the relationship for a whole life long.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, because like you said, the best way to, even if they do experience trauma, their first resource will be the parent, and having a strong foundation, that connection with the parent is vital so that they can actually receive the support.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I'd love for you to maybe touch on highlighting some like evidence-based practices for managing childhood anxiety and stress that parents may find accessible and effective. I know childhood anxiety and well, preteen and teen anxiety and depression, I know they're significantly on the rise, but
sure.
due to like technology and all this other stuff. But even I feel like even that, like it kind of goes back to like how we live now in modern society and the independence that everyone kind of, the phone pulls you away in a very independent way from your household, even from the people in your house, and the interdependency and connection is compromised because we're attached to the phone now, not to the provider, and that creates anxiety and stress. But yeah, any thoughts on that?
Delay social media as long as you can. That is definitely some good advice I've got. Another one is I feel like I read this somewhere the other day, but the greatest predictor of cell phone usage in teens is their parents' own cell phone usage. So again, just
Mm,
think about it as modeling. So, there's this phrase in therapy, we do what we know, and I think it's so apt to this situation. So whatever you're
mhm.
doing, there's a good chance that your kids are going to do similar.
Yeah, and that can be so scary for us as parents, right? Because it's like, I'm still working on that. I'm
Of
still working on
course.
managing my own, like, bedtime routine, maybe, or social media use, or whatever it is, right? Self-regulation.
Yes,
But yeah,
definitely.
yeah. The more we can focus on ourselves, the more we're actually, and it kind of ties in with like how parents, especially moms, will be like, well, what self-care? Like, I don't have time for that. But to your point, like we kids will do what they see role
Hmm.
modeled, and so
Yeah.
if they don't see you doing self-care and practicing self-discipline with social media and cell phone use, and how you handle anxiety, depression, stress, do you reach out for help, or do you try to just grind away at it on your own? That's what they're going to learn, right?
Absolutely. And I think something you said earlier, like for parents who are working on it, you don't have to keep that a secret from your kid. Like, you can say like, "Oh my gosh, this is tough for me and I'm working on it. Like, I'm going to put my phone down now." And, like parents have things to work on too. We all do for our entire
Yeah.
lives. We all have things to work on, and that is normal. And I think taking that approach with kids help them realize that when they have a struggle, when they hit a road bump, when they have something to work on, it's normal too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. No, I love that. It normalizes it and kind of throws out perfectionism out the window
Mhm.
because again, like who wants to raise a perfectionist kid? Anyone that thinks they need to be perfect, right? Like not that wants to, but might end up doing it, right? So if we
Sure.
don't want to do that, we have to get rid of that concept as a goal for ourselves because that's what our kid is going to think is their goal too. Yeah.
Absolutely. I have this little intervention I have for perfectionist families that I work with.
Uh-huh.
Anytime anybody in the home makes a mistake, they have to do like a little song and dance. I made a mistake. And it's helpful for the parents too. Like in
Yeah.
normalizing, everyone in this family makes mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of
Mm-hmm.
normalizes that this is part of being human and we can recognize it and celebrate it. And it's not something we have to be ashamed of and hide away and deny or disavow.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think, ashamed of is definitely like on point. I think the flip side of perfectionism is anxiety and shame, right? And
Mhm.
so, like, that's what's driving that perfectionism is feeling shame and feeling anxious. So, yeah, yeah, I love that. And kind of as we wrap up, would love to hear thoughts on if a parent, like, if a child does have like an upcoming medical procedure, or maybe they are living in an environment that's chaotic right now or traumatic for the child and the parent knows it and they're doing the best that they can to like change the situation or maybe even with a medical procedure it's like you're scheduled to have it or whatever the child's going to have it but what can parents do proactively to reduce the impact of potentially traumatic events on their children yeah.
Sure. Well, with the example, I feel like medical stuff is a great way to get some insight into this. So a big part of anxiety is fear about the future and like unknown about the future. So demystify what's going to happen. You talk to them about it. So
Hmm.
even like, I mean, it doesn't have to be some big medical procedure like flu shots, for example. Talk
Yeah.
about what's going to happen. Okay, we're going to drive to your doctor's office. They're going to put us in a room. Then we're going to wait for the nurse. When they're there, they're going to like take an alcohol prep pad and they're going to rub it on, if it's a young kid, probably their leg, if it's an older kid, their arm. And if you don't know the answer, you can also call the doctor's office and ask them ahead of time so that you have the right information. And then they're going to put the shot in. Will it hurt? I actually prefer being honest about this. So like, yes, it will probably hurt a little bit. Like for me, it hurts about as much as a mosquito bite. And the reason it's important to be honest about these things is because your kids won't trust you if you lie.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can help them
Yeah.
that first time not to be afraid of it, but then they won't trust you after that. Then we'll put the band-aid on and just talking through it so that they know what to expect. I
Hmm.
also love the strategy of cope ahead. This is from dialectical behavior therapy, but if you know you've got something scary coming up, just planning what's going to
Hmm.
help you out. So, you know, I try not to let my kids have a ton of electronics, but when it's time for the flu shot, like you better believe we bring their iPads and they can watch their favorite TV show while they're getting their flu shot.
Hmm. Hmm. So it's almost like planning in advance, gathering information, feeling out the landscape, looking at what it's going to be painful at some point. What are the resources? It kind of reminds me of like preparing to have a baby or something, right? Like
Yes.
maybe your first baby and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so scared, but I know I can't get out of this. This baby's got to come out one way or another,
Uh-huh.
right? So like, what
Yes.
am I going to do? But I think the more prepared parents are, and sometimes it doesn't go as expected, but even then,
Right.
can you plan for that? What will you do? What support will you give yourself if everything kind of goes upside down? Like, what's something that you
Sure.
can use no matter what, right?
Right.
Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah, 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 I love that. And yeah, like as we wrap up, Yeah, any kind of like last thoughts, or maybe even like, when would parents know that they need to like get a copy of your book and learn a little bit more? We talked a little bit about the signs and symptoms of when kids have experienced traumas, but would you say it's kind of like, I don't know, I love this stuff, so I have your book anyway, but I find that life in general can present so many traumas like
Yeah,
unexpectedly. And it's like nobody gets out of this not traumatized in some way, right? Whether it's big or small. And so I find it helpful, like you talked about with this process of being proactive about trauma inducing events. Like, can we all benefit from learning a little bit more about this? And kind of looking like educating ourselves, gathering information so that we can kind of spot like, oh, is there something going on here? Maybe I need to get some professional help for my child.
absolutely. Oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, I think it is relevant because so many of these things that have the potential to traumatize kids are so common. So,
Yeah.
I mean, even just like a hurricane, like
Yeah.
that has the potential to traumatize, or a car crash, like these very unfortunately
Hmm.
things that are like relatively ordinary, have the
Yeah.
potential to traumatize. Yeah, I mean, even things like sexual abuse, when we think about the
Yeah.
prevalence rate, like
Hmm.
gosh, some studies say like 1 in 3, 1 in 4 girls, before their 18th birthday. So I think that, yeah, these things are relevant to everyone. And, learning about it ahead of time could help you feel more prepared for when your child does hit a road bump, whether it
Hmm.
is something relatively ordinary or some freak event that happens.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's really helpful. Yeah, I think that's no shame about experiencing traumas, like you said, plenty of it out there that's so ordinary. But and the key is like there's so much hope, right? Like there's even if
Yes.
your child has been traumatized, even if you maybe suspect maybe there's some trauma, there's something off, something's different, something's going on, really no shame, but gather information, educate yourself. And then when should parents seek out professional support, would you say?
Ooh, yes. Okay. So I would say when it's interfering with day-to-day life, seek out professional support. And if you don't know, like it
Yeah.
does not hurt to call a therapist for a consultation call. So even if your kid is like
Hmm.
super against going to therapy, you can still like you don't have to drag your kid into therapy,
Yeah.
but call a therapist. Tell them what you're seeing. Ask them if you
Yeah.
should be concerned. So I think
Hmm.
that is always okay. But when it's interfering with day-to-day life, so you're noticing like changes in eating, changes in sleeping, changes in school performance, changes in socializing. It's interfering with their day-to-day life. And I think that would be a good point to get a therapist involved.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, I love that. I think parents are like, at least I know for myself, having three kids, my pediatrician is like, like my one of my most important contacts, right, for my
Yeah.
kids, like the pediatrician. Like something happens pretty regularly where it's like, I don't know what's going on. Can you take a look at this? Or like some random rash or some kind
Yep.
of like symptoms or another fever, like what's behind this? So I would hope that parents could start to see childhood traumas, and even if it's not a trauma, maybe just anxiety and like stress, unresolved stress, mental health challenges for kids, just like calling a pediatrician, but you call somebody else that does know about the mental health of kids, right? Like you're reporting like what you're seeing. If your kid's struggling, you're reporting what you're seeing and you're getting the help. I don't see it any different than a call to the pediatrician. Maybe you start with the pediatrician, but I
Yep.
think often they will refer you.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great place to start is call your pediatrician and tell them what's going on and ask for referrals. They get this call like multiple times a day, every day that they're working. So I would
Hmm.
trust your pediatrician's resources and also feel free to call a few people and get to know them before scheduling an initial appointment, see who you feel like would be the best fit for your kid. And then you can also ask your kid about their preferences. Like, okay,
Yeah.
would you rather see a male or a female therapist, or maybe somebody non-binary? Like, what feels most comfortable to you? A morning or an afternoon appointment, in person or virtual, and give them some agency in the process. That usually helps
Yes.
with their engagement in therapy too.
Yeah, I love that. Instead of like being dragged to this.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, like they have some choice. Yeah, finding some win-wins and yeah. I love that. Super helpful. Thank you so much for your time today. I won't take up any more of it, but I really appreciate you coming on today. And we're going to link your website. If you want to share a little bit about your resources on your website, we'll definitely link it below here and the link to your book as well. But any other?
Perfect. Other than my website and the book, my favorite resource is nctsn.com. It stands for National Child Traumatic Stress Network. They just have a wealth of information on there. So that would be my other recommendation.
Awesome. Yeah, I've checked them out and they have a lot of free resources for parents,
Yeah,
educational content, and it's just good general knowledge, right? Because we are kind of like the first responder. We need to know all the resources out there so we know where to go when trouble stirs up.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for your time. It's been great talking to you and really appreciate it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good talking to you. Bye.
Thanks. All right. Bye.